and we will get started. Thank you for everyone who participated in our fun little icebreaker, just as everyone was getting logged in. So I want to take a few minutes and thank everyone for attending the Lewis and Clark Lake Watershed Flood Risk Review meeting. We really appreciate your time. We know everyone is busy. We know things are really weird right now, so we appreciate the time that you're taking to join us today. Some of you have maybe been involved in some meetings in the past, some of you maybe not. We'll be able to cover all the bases and get everyone up to speed on where we're at. I want to throw out there, this is our first virtual meeting, so if we have any bumps along the way, please bear with us. Mackenzie is going to help with any technical difficulties, so just know this is the first time we've done this. We appreciate your time, and bear with us if we have any technical difficulties along the way. Some rules of the road. Attendees will be muted during the presentation to help eliminate any background noise. However, if you have something you'd like to say, feel free to unmute yourself, or if we get to one of the more interactive pieces of the meeting, feel free to unmute yourself and speak up. You can use the chat to ask questions during the presentation. As questions come in, we can pause, or maybe when we get to a poll question, we can start answering some of those questions. But we're pretty informal in how we do presentations at DNR. So if we get to a place in the presentation that you just want to unmute and ask a question, feel free to do that. We're not going to be offended by that at all. If you want to share your video, please do. Most of the DNR staff should have their videos on if they have the capability of doing so. This gives you an opportunity to see who we're talking about, and we'd love to do the same with your faces. If you're not comfortable doing that, you can leave your video off, or you can toggle it on and off as we go. If you have any technical difficulties, send a private chat to Mackenzie, or you can email her at mackenziemerritt@nebraska.gov. We are recording today's meeting for those who aren't able to attend, or if any of you have an interest in going back and rewatching any piece of it. Zoom features, for anyone who is not familiar with this platform, if you need to mute or unmute, it's this little microphone looking symbol on the lower left corner. Video on or off is the little video camera right next to that. We will be using the chat feature on and off today, so that's this little symbol here. And there is a way that you can select to send just to a specific person, or you can send it to everyone. It defaults to everyone. If you want to send a message just to someone that's logged into the call, you can select them from a dropdown. I will caution you that sometimes it doesn't remember when you've selected the dropdown. I've been on webinars and meetings where someone thought they were talking to someone privately and it sent it to everyone. So just a word of warning, it could do that. We also have the reactions feature. If you have a strong reaction to something, feel free to use that if you'd like. There will be 3 poll questions in the presentation today. This is an example of what those polls will look like. The polls are anonymous to anyone that's attending the meeting, but DNR will be able to pull the information in the background of the meeting after it's over so that we can reach out to anyone who had specific needs after the meeting. And you'll click on, they're all multiple choice, so you click on a button and then you have to hit submit at the bottom for it to record your answer. So quick introductions of the DNR staff that are involved in the meeting today. I am Jamie Ranke. I'm an engineer in the floodplain management section. I manage a lot of the projects and also do most of the review work for the section. We also have with us Jared Ashton. He is a project manager and engineer on the team, and he also helps with base flood elevation determinations for those of you who submit those requests. Ji-Hoon Kim is one of our natural resource specialists. He helped create the Zone A boundaries and also the flood risk products that we're going to talk about later in the meeting. So if you have any questions, he'll be available to answer them. Adele Phillips is our mitigation coordinator, and we will have a piece that's talking about mitigation later on. So she will be available for questions. Michelle York. Many of you have probably seen some information coming from Michelle in the course of scheduling this meeting. She'll be taking notes for our meeting and she'll be doing some follow-up too. So we appreciate everything she's done to get us this far. And then Mackenzie Merritt is going to be the one running the show in the background for me and handling any technical difficulties. So feel free to reach out to any of the DNR staff, either during the meeting or after the meeting. We're always happy to help. If anyone is interested in coming off mute, you can introduce yourself, tell us who you represent, what your role is with your agency, or you can type it in the chat. If anyone is in a conference room with multiple people that maybe didn't register for the meeting, if you could provide their information in the chat, that would be really helpful to us. No takers. Am I going to have to start calling people out?
I'm Liz Dorr, and I do the zoning and the floodplain administration for both Knox and Antelope County.
Great. Thank you for attending, Liz. We have Lori from FEMA. She works for Region 7. Thanks for attending, Lori. We appreciate it. Annette from the Lewis and Clark Lake or Lewis and Clark Natural Resources District in Hardington. Thanks for attending. I saw a few folks from NEMA on the line too. Lexi and Heather, I think.
Yeah, I'm Heather Toll, and I'm a newer hazard mitigation planning specialist with NEMA.
Great, thanks, Heather.
I'm Lexi Hint. I'm the Deputy State Hazard Mitigation Officer.
All right. Anyone else?
I'm Brian Gotch, and I'm with the Village of Newcastle.
Great, thanks for attending.
I'm Joe O'Neill, Dakota County Planning and Zoning and Floodplain Administrator.
Great, thank you. It looks like Tom Perez from Thurston County, the emergency manager and floodplain management, etc. One of those people that gets to wear lots of hats for his jurisdiction. Pat Guy, the utilities superintendent, and Natalie, the city clerk, floodplain administrator, are here. All right. Thank you, everyone, for letting us know that you're here and for taking the time to attend. We'll go ahead and keep moving. So to start out the presentation today, I think it's important that we explain why it is that we do the work that we do. We have evidence in DNR's office of flooding all the way back to 1881 in photos. Not to say that there wasn't flooding occurring before then. We know that flooding has been going on much longer in time than that. We have some example photos in the presentation. The Republican River flood in 1935. This was the most catastrophic flood in Nebraska's history and prompted some changes in how floodplain management was occurring in the state, which continues even to this day. This is flooding that occurred in Lincoln in the 1950s. We saw significant flooding in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, as we'll talk about later today. And then more recent examples, the Missouri River in 2011 and 2019. And while in 2011, this wasn't necessarily a 100-year event or 1% annual chance event, the flooding was still quite severe. Flooding is the most common and costly natural hazard. Approximately 75% of disaster declarations involve some level of flooding. And that's why it's important that we understand how and where it's likely to flood in your area. So why do we need to update your flood maps specifically? Because flood risk changes over time, and that can be for many reasons. It can be development or just changes in how the land is being used. In the area that we're presenting to today, Cedar, Dixon, Antelope, and Pierce counties last had updated flood risk information in the 70s and 80s, and all of that information is in paper format, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Knox County was updated in 2005, but an FIS for the study was not prepared, so there's no information related to how the boundaries were created. Dakota County was updated in 2012, but only pieces of the county were updated with new information, and there's no discussion in the FIS related to how those Zone A boundaries were developed. In this study, we're proposing, and we have funding to move forward with new regulatory maps, new effective maps for Cedar and Dixon counties, but not to say that there's not a possibility of new effective maps happening elsewhere as we get down the line. But for right now, we will be moving forward with new regulatory maps for Cedar and Dixon counties as part of this study. So the maps that are available only in paper format, they only exist in paper format or scanned format through FEMA's Map Service Center. There's little or no data behind how the boundaries were created to make the maps. This makes the maps difficult to regulate from and difficult to recreate. So if someone were going to do a development that they needed to determine base flood elevations, it's pretty unlikely they'd be able to match the boundary spot on. And you can see that it's difficult to find structure level information on the paper maps. The topographic data was often based on USGS quad maps from the 60s. Some of those may have had some updates, but there was limited contour information. They were often 5 or 10 foot contour intervals. So the boundaries are less accurate than they can be now since we have more detailed information that's available to us. So the updated flood risk that's part of this project will show aerial imagery in the background, making homes and structures much easier to identify. The data is in digital format and geo-referenced, so it just shows up where it belongs in your community. There's no more measuring, no more guessing at where the properties are in relation to the floodplain. The information shows up where it should. It's based on more detailed and accurate topographic information. So we use LIDAR now, LIDAR being a large scale data collection method for determining ground elevations. It's a simpler way of collecting information than, say, sending out survey crews to survey an entire watershed. That would be pretty labor intensive and not necessarily the best use of resources. For this study, the LIDAR was collected in 2011, 2013, or 2017, depending on where you're at in the watershed. I think the biggest benefit in my mind is that the data is reproducible. FEMA now has a requirement that all data has to be model backed, meaning there has to be specific information available behind each study, whether it's Zone A or Zone AE. So I think it helps everyone be able to regulate the information. But the new maps will also help determine where flood insurance is required for structures with federally backed mortgages. And it provides the basis for updating your floodplain management ordinance, which is your tool for reducing your community's flood risk. And DNR, when we get to that phase of work in the project, will help you with that. We have a model ordinance that's available. It includes higher standards if anyone is interested in adopting higher standards or including them in an ordinance. So once we get there, we will help walk you through that process. What we want to achieve today, we really want to help you understand your community's current flood risk and, more importantly, get your feedback on what the draft maps show us. Reviewing other flood risk data tools that are available, the flood risk products in particular, which we'll talk about later in the presentation, and how those products can help you make informed decisions about reducing flood risk in your community. And then we'll do a quick review of what's coming next in the project and the role that you'll play in those next steps. But first, a quick recap of where we've been. As I've mentioned, flood risk changes over time for lots of reasons, natural changes, new construction. So it's important that we go back and look at this information. We started that process at DNR in 2017. However, there was a discovery phase that happened in 2012. That was handled by a contractor, and DNR probably had some involvement. It was before my time at the agency, so I can't speak specifically to it. But you may have had some communication with someone in 2012 related to discovery. You may have seen a report, been invited to a meeting. So the discovery happened in 2012, but in 2017, DNR was funded to do what FEMA refers to as base level engineering, which is essentially creating Zone A boundaries for the watershed to determine if it makes sense to move forward with new regulatory products anywhere. So the discovery meeting happened in June of 2012. We did that base level engineering study in 2017. And then we were funded to do what FEMA calls data development, which is the engineering behind creating new flood risk information, creating these flood risk products. And we had a kickoff meeting for that data development phase in early 2019. So it's been a while since we've met with you. And if you are at any of those meetings, great. You'll probably see some information that you've seen before. If you weren't at any of those meetings, we do have a quick recap of kind of how we got to where we are and then going into the next steps. So this meeting is technically the end of data development minus one step that happens after this, which we'll talk about toward the end of the meeting. All of the work that we've done has been completed in-house by DNR with financial support from FEMA. So our first poll question, if Mackenzie can pull that up for me. How many of you have attended any of the meetings to date? All of them, just one of them, none of them, or I'm new to my role and don't have any background in this project? And we'll give everyone a few seconds. Once we see that most of the attendees have answered, we'll end the poll and we can move on. All right, it looks like we have the majority of the people that have attended one meeting and then kind of a mix of people who have attended none or are new to their role. So I think the recap is going to be really helpful, and anyone that has any questions beyond what we go through today, feel free to reach out to us or ask questions during the meeting. We've got plenty of time today. So community partners that have been with us along the way, we want to take an opportunity to thank you all for your participation. Ultimately, we recognize that these maps are yours and you have to regulate from them long term. So it's really important that you're engaged and involved in this process. And part of that comes in this next step too, that we'll talk about, this review period that happens after this meeting. But if you have participated in discovery, attended meetings, provided any information to our office to help us with this study, we appreciate that. We appreciate you taking time to read our project updates and all of those things that have been happening in this project for years now. The next phase of our meeting will go into the review of the draft maps and going through that updated flood risk. This is the part where it gets a little bit more interactive, and we want you to know that you can come off mute and participate. We can talk about this offline after the meeting too. Just know that we want your feedback and we want this to be an open discussion if you're comfortable doing that. Anyone that attended the kickoff meeting probably saw this slide. This is one that we like to use to show kind of that mapping process from a really high level view, not getting into the weeds too far. But the first step of any data development project is that collection of base map information, as FEMA calls it, as we call it. And that would be collecting aerial information, the aerial photography to use in the background. We would be reaching out to communities to obtain your community boundaries, your extraterritorial jurisdictions, your ETJs, if you regulate to them. That boundary needs to come from you. Road names, any local features that show up that we know will show up on a firm panel later down the line. That's what we're collecting during base map. We add the base map collection into the topography that we're going to use for the study. So for Zone A mapping, we use LIDAR, as I mentioned, that large scale data collection method to determine ground elevations. And that was collected in 2011, 2013, 2017. If we had an enhanced study in this area that we were going to be completing, we would supplement that with survey of bridges, some flow line information, any drop structures, things that would impact the hydraulics. There were no enhanced studies that were done in the Lewis and Clark Lake watershed. We had one that had been done previously that was new enough that it'll be incorporated into the information. There are two enhanced studies that are occurring in Cedar and Dixon County, but they're in the Logan Creek watershed, not in Lewis and Clark Lake. So we take that ground elevation information, we do the analysis, the engineering, and we create these flood boundaries. that are based 100% on LiDAR and cross-section information. So this boundary, if it were overlaid onto the LiDAR, the elevations on the edges of the floodplain would match the LiDAR. This example shows a floodway. So if it were an enhanced study, it would have this floodway boundary in the middle. If it's zone A, it would only show this 1% or 0.2% boundary. And once you add all of those pieces together, this is essentially what it would look like on a firm panel with some road names and some more base map information on there. But you would have base flood elevation determination, or base flood elevations, floodway, and then the two boundaries. DNR on our firm panels, we don't usually publish the BFEs separate now. We usually publish an elevation at a cross section. It cleans up the firm panels a little bit, but a base flood elevation determination from our office would very much look like this with the squiggly little BFE lines. So through this process, we develop a few different products. We create these draft floodplain boundaries, and then we also, in data development, create what we call flood risk products. And during this meeting, after this meeting, we want your feedback on the information that you're reviewing. Now is the time to provide that before we get into the regulatory steps. That preliminary issuance is really kind of where we transition from being able to make a lot of changes or make necessary changes to the maps, with DNR being able to do that. Once we issue preliminary products, we're kind of locked into what the maps are showing, and it's a much more labor-intensive process to change anything on the maps at that time. But we're still in that draft form now, so we have a lot more flexibility to be able to look into any concerns that you may have. We develop tools that should help you with your daily work. Most of you are floodplain administrators or emergency managers. We create these flood risk products, and we're going to get into a little bit more detail about them in coming slides, and we'll also do a tour of an interactive map that has them on there. The products that are created are the flood risk report, the flood risk map, which we'll talk about in the next two slides. Then we have data tools that help visualize flood risk in a different way than we're used to. So I think everyone on the call is probably used to floodplain maps being a boundary. You're in or you're out. Now we have products that can show depth of flooding or percent chance flooding in a given location. And it's a much easier way to describe flood risk to residents. So we have flood depth grids, percent annual chance grids, percent 30-year chance grids. All three of those, I will cover what those mean when we get to the map review here in just 3 slides. We have changes since last firm. This will only apply to areas that have existing digital data. So those counties that have paper format only, there's not changes since last firm because we don't have a boundary in digital format to compare that to. The flood risk assessment is a statewide assessment that we use to determine flood risk. And then the areas of mitigation interest are areas that are identified in a hazard mitigation plan, or maybe areas of planned mitigation in your community pinpointed on a map. So the flood risk report provides background, including an overview of flood hazards and risks, risk reduction practices in the area. It can go through methodology and results of the study. So it'll talk about the depth grids, the percent annual chance grids, that flood risk assessment that we use, and then if there were any enhanced studies, it can get into the details of those. The flood risk map shows flood risk data, any risk reduction activities or the impacts of those risk reduction activities, areas where mitigation might be needed. And this really encourages the community to focus on reducing risk at this point. So now we're going to do a quick review of some flood risk data in our interactive map. So bear with me for just a second while I pull up the map. We have a new interactive map that we just launched this week, so this might look slightly different to anyone who's used it before. Are you seeing my screen with the interactive map? Yes, great. Okay, so This is on DNR's website. If you go down to the floodplain management page, it's our main floodplain interactive map. You will have to hit agree on the left and then continue on the right. And then there are a couple different ways that you can search for communities. You can search it by typing directly into the search bar, or there's this popular searches and you can search by community, and it's got a drop down list. And if you start typing in the name of a community, it'll auto populate and then you hit apply. There are also ways to search by section and do a whole bunch of other things too, but these are the two for getting just to a community. There are a number of layers that are just auto turned on, BFEs and effective maps. I'm going to turn a lot of these off for this demo because we don't need them. This National Flood Hazard layer, the preliminary NFHL, and the pending NFHL are all FEMA layers. That's where the effective studies reside. We have had some problems with that layer being a little slow to load. So if our interactive isn't working, turn those layers off first and see if that helps. And then this flood awareness area is the layer that we use once we get far enough into a study that the boundaries have been created, reviewed, and are pretty well set for the phase of study that we're in. We put them into this flood awareness area so that local officials can start using them, getting used to seeing what that data looks like, sharing with the public if you're so interested. And then they move into the FEMA layers when we get further in. So the preliminary NFHL layer is where they reside once we issue preliminary products. But we are still in flood awareness area territory at the end of data development. I'm going to zoom in a little bit and turn off that paper map once everything loads. And of course, this went really fast when I practiced this morning, and now it's going to go really slow. There, the paper map. You can see that the paper map, it's just a bunch of dots that represent the floodplain. So it's kind of hard to tell where that edge of that boundary actually is. And there were some changes to the flood risk information in Ponca. We see a wider floodplain here than was there before. To turn on the depth grid, so this is the 1% annual chance depth grid. This would be the depth of flooding that's occurring at a location during that 1% annual chance event, that 100-year flood. And if I zoom in a little closer and click on the map, so I'll click in the middle of the channel at that location of that triangle, it's 21.3 feet deep during a 1% annual chance flood event. If we were to look at a specific property, say this building here, this corner, it's 0.3 of a foot of flooding, and this corner is 0.4 of a foot of flooding because it's a little bit closer to the channel. That makes sense. If we were to choose a property down here, it's 1.4 foot. And then we have that same depth information for the 0.2% or 500-year flood. And you'll see that the depth of flooding is a little bit greater at 1.2. And then down here, 2.2. So the percent annual chance flood risk is a little bit harder to understand. So if you have questions on this, feel free to reach out. The grid looks a little bit different, you can see, but what we're showing in this image is the percent chance any given year that a specific structure will flood or specific location will flood. So if I click on this corner of this building that I've been using, there's a 1.2% chance any year that some amount of flooding is going to occur there. It's not related to 1% annual chance. It's not related to 0.2% annual chance. It's just there's a 1.2% chance there could be flooding at that location. If we go down to this house down here that I clicked on before, there's a 10% chance any given year that that location will flood. Were there any specific questions that were coming in on that? It doesn't look like it. And then the percent 30-year chance flood is a similar concept, but instead of any given year, there we're looking at the percent chance over the course of 30 years that a location will flood. So a typical mortgage being 30 years, we're trying to show the chance or the likelihood that a flood is going to occur over the lifetime of a mortgage. So this first structure that I've been clicking on, there's a 33% chance that that location will flood over the course of 30 years. And it can change even based on the corner by a little bit. So there's almost 33% chance there. This structure that I've been clicking on in the red that's closer to the channel, there's almost a 96% chance that flooding will occur at that location over the course of 30 years. So these tools we feel are really beneficial. They've helped that conversation come a little easier when we're talking one-on-one with residents, because it's no longer that you're in or out. It's, you know, yes, you're in, but there might be only 1/10 of a foot of flooding as opposed to more than that. Bear with me for a second. I'm having some technical difficulties on my side. So now we have a poll question that Mackenzie can bring up for me. How would you most like to look at your draft floodplain boundaries? This is multiple choice. With a live guided tour like we just did, a PDF via email that you can print, a mailed copy of a paper map, you're comfortable reviewing this on your own on an interactive map, or you could review this information on the interactive map but would need some help with that. Okay, I think I've got my technical difficulties fixed while that poll was going, so that's good. Okay, so it looks like most people feel comfortable with a PDF that they get through email that they can print. There was an equal mix of people who like the live guided tour and or are comfortable reviewing it on their own. It's kind of an even mix. So any of you that want that live guided tour or need help using the interactive map, feel free to reach out to anyone from DNR. We will pull the information afterwards too, and we can follow up with you as well. So the people who want a PDF copy via email, we can also work with you to make sure that we're getting you what you want. All right. And you're able to see my screen all right, despite my technical difficulties? Okay, so when we're saying that there's an opportunity for you to review the maps or review the information that's been tied into this study, there are a number of things that we're wanting you to look for, and they can range from fairly simple to a little more complex. The simple things that we want every community to look at, every jurisdiction to look at, would be your community boundary, your ETJ if you regulate to one. If those boundaries are wrong on the map, then we have the wrong information in our office, and the wrong information will end up on a firm panel, and that's not what we want to see. We aren't the repository for that information, and we know that you know your boundaries, you have to adopt them. So if you can provide us with an updated boundary if that's showing up wrong, we would really appreciate that. Other things that would be really easy for you to look at are making sure that road names are right, any features that are showing up or may show up on a firm panel, that those are named correctly on the map. That would be helpful. We pull it from a national database, but that database is only as updated as the information that's submitted into the database. So other things that we're asking you to look for during the review phase, where you've experienced significant flooding, and maybe if the boundaries are making sense in relation to that flooding that's occurred. So in 2019, DNR had some areas that had recently gone through mapping, and then we had inundation boundaries that were available from the flood event. And what we found was, even though the recurrence interval wasn't the same, so even though it may not have been a 1% annual chance flood event in those communities, the boundary was matching pretty closely. So we would expect to see the same thing if you've experienced flooding in your community. Areas that have repeatedly flooded with property loss. These are locations that maybe would be worth targeting for mitigation projects or buyouts. It's certainly areas that we would want to focus on mitigation to help reduce that likelihood of property loss and impacts to the community. Locations where recent development has occurred, especially those developments that have occurred since LIDAR was flown in 2011, 2013, or 2017, depending on where you're at. Since all of our mapping is based on LIDAR information from those years, any development that's occurred since that time won't be reflected in the maps. The only way we can incorporate it into the maps at this point is if we are provided survey information or something to base that off of in those locations where development has occurred. Locations of planned new development. This is important because the floodplain boundaries are likely changing in many locations. And if you have areas that are planned for new development, it would be a good idea to make sure that they're not going to end up being in the newly defined floodplain, and maybe discussing options on what needs to happen if that is the case. Where you've taken steps to control flooding, so maybe you've added culverts or new culverts, new bridges, mitigation projects of any sort that have changed how that flooding is occurring, perhaps. Those would be important for us to know about. In Zone A areas, we're not taking structures into account, it's bare earth, but it's still helpful information for us to know. Areas where you have prioritized to address flooding. So maybe some locations that have experienced flooding, or that there might be some easy ways to solve some flooding in specific locations in town. We would be interested in knowing that. And there's even the potential that we might be able to help with pieces of that. We have funding now to do what we call real-time technical assistance. And that would be, taking information from you that would just require maybe some simple modeling. So we had one recently where we were able to take an enhanced study. We were able to do some different scenarios, adding culverts, increasing size of structures at different locations to see what impact it had on the floodplains upstream. There's some stipulations tied to how that funding works, so we would have to work with you specifically related to your request, but it is out there, so it's a possibility, and we'd like to talk about that with you. If we don't get this information from you, we're likely not going to know it. We know that you are the experts in your communities and we are not. So anything that you can give us is helpful to this project. So now we're going to move into the mitigation discussion, that how to reduce your community's flood risk. And I think more often than not, it's really helpful to define what we're talking about when we're talking of mitigation, because it can be really confusing. Mitigation is taking action to reduce the risk of loss of life and property during a disaster and implementing active measures to prevent the adverse effects of disasters. So think about the people, the things you value most. What steps could you take today to protect those lives and properties from a future flood event? To keep communities safe and get back on their feet after a disaster? This is what we're talking about when we're talking about mitigation. And we'll go through some examples of some of the more common mitigation type things. This is certainly not an all-inclusive list. A common one that you'll hear a lot about is home elevation. So homes that are repeatedly flooding, we would lift them up above the floodwater to avoid that repeated flood loss cost, the community effort for rescue during a disaster. You can see some examples. These can be fairly crude. This is a home that was lifted on, looks like 4x4 posts, pretty simple. This on the right is a structure in Kansas actually, and they raised their entire home, built a garage underneath, and you can see they also have their flood vents. So in the event of a flood, water can still pass through that garage and open space because of the vents. So there's no pressure on the structure. The walls should be sound so that they're not having issues due to the flooding. But the people are elevated out of harm's way unless they have a more catastrophic flood, I suppose. But reducing that cost of insurance and also that cycle of flood, rebuild, flood, rebuild. Buyouts and relocation. Sometimes the flood risk is so great that it just doesn't make sense to do anything other than remove the property or relocate the property to somewhere else. Oftentimes when we're talking about buyouts and relocation in Nebraska, we're speaking about examples in Beatrice, Nebraska. They're kind of the showcase for having this robust buyout program. However, we are in a portion of the state that has some local examples. So in 1881, Niobrara experienced devastating flooding for weeks and weeks and weeks. And the community decided after that flood event that they wanted to move to higher ground. They didn't want to have to rebuild their community every time it flooded. And they did that. It took them, maybe a year and cost them around $40,000 to do it. And they moved to higher ground. In the 1950s, when all of the Missouri River flood control dams were constructed, they started to see some changes again. So in 1972, as the water behind Gavin's Point Dam reached its pool elevation, creating the Lewis and Clark Lake, residents again started experiencing flooding, mostly in the form of basement flooding from what I read. The community again voted to move to higher ground, and over the course of 4.5 years, approximately 70% of the population had moved to higher ground at a cost of about $14.5 million. So you can see, in 1881, they had this flood, and here's an example of them moving their properties uphill, which looks a lot different today, but you have some really good history on mitigation that's been successful. Critical facilities. So critical facilities are those facilities that need to remain operational in your community after a disaster. So examples being hospitals, nursing homes, emergency operations centers, shelters, water treatment facilities, similar locations. The example on this map is Ponca, and this was pulled from their mitigation plan. So all of these yellow dots show the areas that they've identified as being their critical facilities. And when we're talking about critical facilities, we need to make sure that they're functioning during a disaster of any sort, but in this relation, we're talking about flooding. So these that are located in the floodplain, if there's a water treatment facility, maybe we need berms built around it to protect the facility from flooding. If it's a fire station that's in the floodplain, maybe it needs to be elevated or removed from the floodplain, things like that. So kind of taking a more comprehensive look at where those critical facilities are located and how you're going to keep them operational in a flood event. Future land use planning. So if you're a community or a county that does future land use planning, of course, the first thing we recommend is incorporating this updated flood risk information and taking a look at where you have future zoning changes that may be residential if they're impacting or in the floodplain. We also at DNR have this comprehensive plans and flood risk guide, and Mackenzie is going to throw the link to that in the chat if anyone is interested in using that in their future land use planning efforts moving forward. I'll go ahead and move on while she is looking for that link. So why does flood risk reduction make sense? There's the obvious. It decreases the cost of flood insurance. If you're elevating a property out of the floodplain, flood insurance won't be required if they're above BFE. They can still purchase flood insurance, but it's going to be cheaper because they're no longer in a zone A if they're elevated above it. If it's removed from the floodplain, then that changes that a little bit even more. It safeguards lives and properties. It helps improve a community's resilience. And resilience is one of those words that gets thrown out there a lot that can oftentimes be confusing as well. So when we're speaking of resilience, we're talking about how well a community recovers or responds, I guess, how well a community responds during an event and how will they recover after. When evaluating a community's resilience, we often look at how quickly we recover, how costly it is for the community to respond to the disaster. Working towards resilience means taking actions now that help keep you and your community safe later. Thinking of those things that your community values most, the well-being of families, safety of homes and neighborhoods, protecting financial investments. Think of the whole health of your community and the quality of life for your residents. Resilience is how much you safeguard those things in advance and how rapidly you can recover in the event of a disaster. So we have a good example of that in Beatrice, which I touched on briefly earlier. There's been great success in Beatrice building resilience in their community and with their mitigation efforts. So in 1973, Beatrice had their most damaging flood on record. And after that time, they'd experienced flooding repeatedly throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s. You know, the Big Blue River was not a stranger to flooding. But in 73, they had this massive flood, and afterwards the community decided to build this program to start acquiring their flood-prone properties and taking action to reduce future flood risk. So over the course of time, you know, fast forward from 73 to 2015, when Beatrice experienced their third largest flood of record, and the officials in town went through and estimated how much money they saved in just that one event. They saved almost $13 million in flood damage from removing those flood-prone properties from harm's way. And what damage did occur in 2015 or 2019, they experienced flooding again, was so much less severe than what would have happened if they hadn't had this robust buyout program. And what we saw were communities in 2015 and more recently in 2019, recovery was taking a long time. And in 2019, we still have examples of communities that are working towards recovery today. Beatrice went to their streets. They moved all of the dirt and debris off where the roads had overtopped. They cleaned off corn stalks from the ball field fence, and you know, they were mostly operational again. There were some exceptions, of course, but overall they were back running like normal fairly quickly. And the other benefit of this is their buyout program. They removed these properties from flood-prone areas, but then they focused on adding amenities to the community that would be of use, of value to people moving into town or people who live there. So they have open space, they have a skateboard park, they have ball fields, they have playgrounds, they have a bike trail. So it's not just sitting there with no use. It's really beautiful, honestly, if you've been to Beatrice. So there was so much value in going through this effort, and they used funding sources that ranged. They use FEMA funding, local funding, they kind of piece together. So you'll find that as you start thinking about mitigation, there are a number of ways that you can get to the end result, and not just one funding program will get you there. And now we have another poll. If Mackenzie could bring that up for me. Do you have projects underway to reduce your flood risk that you could use help with? Yes, no, no, but I could use some help getting something off the ground, or I'd like to know more about how you can help. We'll give everyone a few seconds to answer. Okay, so the majority of people answered no, which is okay. Maybe when we start getting into actually reviewing the flood risk data changes, maybe that answer changes, maybe not. We're always trying to keep an eye on mitigation. There are lots of opportunities out there, not just related to flood risk too. We had one person answer yes, a few people that answered no but could use some help. So again, feel free to reach out to DNR or NEMA, and we'll talk through the funding sources next and give you some contact info. And there are a few people that would like to know more about how we could help. So we will certainly follow up. Okay, so potential funding sources. There are grants available for mitigation projects. The FEMA programs would be the top three. So Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP. The new one is Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, BRIC. This replaces the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant, PDM, that you maybe have heard of in the past. BRIC is different, and I am not the expert on BRIC, but there are people who are better suited to answer your questions related to that. The HMGP and BRIC programs are managed by NEMA, the Nebraska Emergency Management Agency, and I would recommend reaching out to the State Hazard Mitigation Officer, John Gassman, or Lexi is on the call. She's the Deputy State Hazard Mitigation Officer. And if you need contact information for her, we can grab that for you. But they can help walk you through the requirements of those programs and the opportunities through those programs. The Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant, FMA, that is the third of the FEMA grant programs. That is managed by the Department of Natural Resources, our office, and Adele Phillips is the person that you should reach out to with questions on that particular grant. Their funding all works a little bit different. The matching can be a little bit different depending on the situation, but generally there's a 25% match for most of the FEMA programs. But there are programs outside of just the FEMA grant programs that exist. Community Development Block Grants, NRCS has some grant programs. You can reach out to your local NRD. The NRDs often are asked and willing to help with match. There are a lot of entities that have joined forces with a number of people. It can be a community, a county, an NRD to provide that 25% match. So there are a lot of different ways that the funding for mitigation programs can happen. And I would recommend reaching out to these resources to get more information. And FEMA also would be able to provide information if needed. So the next steps, we're toward the very end of our presentation for today. We'll talk about what is happening next and the roles of everyone moving forward. So the next steps for DNR. After today's meeting, we will send out a letter to each community requesting that you review the floodplain boundaries and provide any feedback that you have. The letter will contain a couple of enclosures. There will be a flood risk product handout that just explains what those products are all about and what they're showing. And then there will be a tutorial for how to submit comments on our online comment site. So this is really the opportunity for you to be able to review the floodplains, make sure they're making sense, and provide comments to us so that we can look into that in more detail. Now, I will throw out there that just because you provide a comment doesn't mean that it's going to change what the floodplain looks like either. We have had a community in the past that went in and provided a comment circling an area saying, I don't want floodplain here, and it included the channel. And that's not a change that we're going to be able to make. The flood risk is based on topographic data. We have to have engineering to be able to support any changes that we're making. We will look into comments. We will provide a response to your comments, but it does not necessarily change what the maps look like. The next step, so this letter that we're sending out today will provide a 30-day review period that's required by FEMA. The review period is going to end in early November, believe it or not. That seems crazy that we're to November. At the end of that review period, we will begin that preliminary product development where we're creating panels, we're creating a flood insurance study, we're looking at the impact to letters of map change within all of the jurisdictions that are being remapped. And our goal is that by spring of 2021, we will issue those preliminary products. So you'll get a big packet in the mail with all of this information. And at that point, we're pretty locked in to what's going to be final. The only way to change the preliminary information is through appeal or letter of map revision at the end once we have effective maps. And the appeal really is a letter of map revision, just without having to submit the fee to FEMA. So you would still have to go through basically those same steps. So it's pretty labor intensive. So my point being that it's important that you review the information now and get us any comments during this draft map phase, as opposed to waiting till we have preliminary products out there. So our goal is that this happens in spring of 2021. If we have a spring like 2019, that could be delayed. If other things come up, it could always be delayed. But our goal is to have spring of 2021 preliminary product issuance. After we issue preliminary products, there is a predefined process that we have to follow to get from preliminary to effective maps. That process generally takes 18 to 24 months, and all of the steps are lined up in an order that they have to occur. If we miss steps, we have to restart. It's kind of all out of our hands on the timeline. It takes 18 to 24 months when we get to those steps that require publishing to the Federal Register. We never really know how long that's going to take. It can take a month or two, or it could take 6 months. It's kind of dependent on what's going on in the world. It can be impacted by hurricane season. If we have a really active hurricane season and FEMA has to pull personnel to help with recovery or disaster response, it can be impacted by government shutdowns or, say, a pandemic. All of those things can impact that Federal Register publication, which then would impact when those effective maps occur. So your next steps, what we're asking of you after this meeting, is to review the floodplain boundaries, your community boundaries, all of that information, and provide any feedback that you have. You can provide that feedback in any way that you're comfortable with. It can be in a comment in our interactive map, our interactive comment site map, which you will get a link to in that email or in the follow-up letter. It can be an email, it can be by phone, it can be by snail mail if you want to print something out and mark on it with a marker and send it to us. We're flexible in how we receive those comments. So if you have any questions on that, feel free to reach out to us. And then let us know if we can help you with mitigation in any way. The key takeaway for today's meeting is that now is the time that we can still incorporate your input into the maps. By the time we get to that next phase, it's going to be much more difficult. The steps to change anything require much more effort and resources and cost on your part. So just know that. So that concludes the presentation piece of the meeting. If anyone has any questions, feel free to come off mute and we can talk through that. If there are no questions, we do have a new story map, an outreach tool that we're going to demo for you to show you how we're going to do future project updates. So I'll pause for a minute to let anyone ask any questions before we move on though.
Hi, Jamie, this is Laurie. So I just have a question on those preliminary and effective timeframes. At this point, do those just apply to Cedar and Dixon counties?
Yes.
Watershed? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is Brian, Village of Newcastle. I was able to go on and get on the interactive maps. When will we see the new updated maps on there, or because this one appears to be older from what I'm viewing?
They should be the newest set in the flood awareness area. If you load the flood awareness area, that should be the layer that shows the newest floodplain boundaries. I will look specifically at Newcastle though, and maybe that's not the case there. Okay, so yeah, there is a new boundary in the flood awareness area for Newcastle. I'm not sure why it's not showing up in the one that's specific to Lewis and Clark Lake, but it is showing up in the main flood awareness area layer. And that's where it should reside. That Lewis and Clark Lake temporary one is going to be absorbed into the flood awareness area layer after today's meeting.
The map I'm viewing with the orange is the updated.
So the orange that you're seeing is the 0.2%, that 500-year floodplain, and the blue is the 1% annual chance floodplain, or the 100-year event.
Okay. So that blue area would be the one with.
Yeah, so the blue area is the 1%. So that regulatory floodplain.
To where people would have to acquire flood insurance.
Yes.
Okay. Because I was just curious, because my map says 2010, so that's why I was wondering if it was updated or not. That was the updated information. And if you zoom in, it tells you it's the 2010 map.
Oh, that might be the base map in the background. That aerial imagery might have been from 2010.
Gotcha. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Did anyone else have any questions? Oh, Liz, did you have a question?
Yeah, just a clarification. You said something about this preliminary and effective map time frame. That's for Cedar and Dixon, but where I already have digital maps for Knox County, will it be changing for the regulatory or not?
No, so Knox County, we're not planning to take to new regulatory maps at this point.
Okay, so there won't be any changes for Knox
Yeah,
County?
our plan right now is not. You will be informed if something changes, because we would have to get funding to do that. We don't have funding for Knox County to go to effective maps, and we don't have it scheduled right now.
So it'll still just use those 2005 or whatever that I've been using all along?
Yep.
Okay. But will this information, like what you're showing on the screen with the blue and the orange, will some of that be available on the interactive maps?
Yes, so we will have it all available in the flood awareness area. And because the study that you had for your Zone A areas in Knox County didn't have any information related to how the Zone A boundaries were created, we will likely be using this information for BFEs moving forward. So BFE determinations that you request through our office will use this data.
Okay. Yeah, I was just kind of curious because, I have a few things that are going on, especially up near Verdell. And that's why I was wondering if my stuff would be changing in the near future.
It won't be in the near future. As we start using these maps more and you get those BFE determinations, if you're seeing that there's a need in your county for updated maps, please let us know. You're using the maps, so you're going to be the most familiar with whether there are issues with your current effective versus the new mapping.
And probably the most prominent change that I can see is closer up to Gavin's Point Dam. I have a number of properties that are 50 foot up in the air on the bluff above the lake area, or the lake level, that show as floodplain that probably shouldn't be floodplain. And so some of them have been doing lomas to get them removed. But
so your effective map boundary may be shifted in that area? Is that what you're saying?
when it was enacted back in 2004, 2005, when I had just started, they were just finishing it up, and I wasn't familiar with all of it at that time, and so there's areas up there that show as being in the floodplain that probably shouldn't have been at that time.
Okay.
So that's why I was wondering if this was going to change my maps, and correct some of that. Now, when the Missouri flooded, the area by Verdell, that was really pretty spot on.
Yeah, once it hits the bluff, it tends to be pretty accurate on the Missouri. The elevation might change, but the boundary itself doesn't change that much. So maybe we'll work with you offline on the area that you're seeing that shifted boundary and see what that's all about.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Liz.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? If not, I will move into this story map. So any of you that have been around for the last year or so should have been receiving project updates every quarter from our office. They come in an email with an attached PDF that just outlines the work that DNR has done the last quarter and what we're projecting to do in the next quarter. We have been working on a project to get rid of those project updates and to have a tool that's more useful to you and that's helpful for the work that you are doing. And we decided to move to the direction of doing story maps. So every project will have a story map. We will have a specific location where we go in and update communities on where we're at in the mapping project. But it provides some of those background details on how we do the work, why we do the work. It provides some resources on the regulatory steps, flood insurance, mitigation, all of those things in kind of a one-stop shop. So this is what the story map for Lewis and Clark Lake Watershed looks like. It is not live yet, so it's not publicly viewable at this point, but we're hoping it will be in the coming weeks. It's just going through some final review. There are tabs on the top that go through the different phases of work that we have going on for each project. The overview just being a general overview of the purpose of the story map, where we are now, just a brief little summary, and then goes through kind of an overview of the mapping project. So if you just wanted that high level, real quick synopsis of what this project is all about, you would go to this tab or send your residents or users to this tab. And you can see that it does a little tour of the different communities. There are maps in the background and goes through the different project phases and milestones. And then we end with these FEMA videos that are available that talk about the different pieces of the mapping program. And we found these videos to be really helpful, and they're talking to the people in these communities that are doing the roles that you serve. So the floodplain administrators, the community officials, it's not an engineer or someone from FEMA that's telling you these things. It's people who do your jobs that are explaining how this process worked for them. So the videos are really great. The updates and milestones tab on the top is where you'll get that project update, and it'll tell you kind of where we're at. So you'll see we're talking about this meeting that's occurring today, this 30-day review that's occurring after this, and then the upcoming step is that we're going to start working on preliminary maps. It'll go through milestones to let you know when we had the different touch points with communities, and then it goes through the regulatory process there at the end. But all of these tabs just cover information that's specific to your project. So flood history, we have photos that are specific to flooding that's occurred in your jurisdiction. We explain the flood history of the Lewis and Clark Lake watershed, and then get some specifics on a town or two. Discovery would go through the actual discovery work that was done, explaining the different steps and data collection that's done. Creating flood risk data, that's the phase that we're in now. So that data development phase, and it will actually walk you through, it has the link to the interactive map that we use today, so you can get to those flood risk products. It's showing in the background there. It also provides a link to the comment site that you will get a link to in the letter that you get in the coming days. So all of the information that you need related to this project will be here. We use some of those FEMA videos again that you can click on, or you don't have to. They're automatically muted, so it won't be something that you're required to do by any means. And then explains our role, the community's role, and then gets into how the boundaries are actually created, showing the cross sections and the grids and all of that really nerdy engineering stuff that I have a lot of love for, but probably not everyone has a lot of love for. I think the thing that most people are concerned with is just the end result boundaries, and you'll see those with a key explaining what's what. So this is the phase that we're in now, and then it'll explain regulatory steps and then general information on flood insurance, reducing flood risk and whatnot. So like I said, this hasn't been released yet. We hope to release it in the very near future, and you will be getting an email or a Gov delivery message indicating that this is live for you to view, and you can go in. Feel free, we have not launched any of these yet. We have a number of them that are ongoing, but feel free to play around with them and reach out to us if you're having problems with information loading, or if you have problems with any of the technology side, or if you have comments on what you're seeing or there are things that are confusing. These are supposed to be tools to help you out and to provide you with updates on where we're at in the project. And it's only helpful to you if you understand what we're talking about. So we would appreciate any feedback that you have on the story maps once they go live. Any questions on that? All right, seeing none, if there are no other questions, then we are done for today. So I just want to thank you all again for your time. We know everyone is busy and that life is strange right now. We appreciate you taking part in this meeting and being involved in this project. So look for those letters to be coming in the next few days, and look for more information on the story map to come. Thank you.